Why do all the firstborn sons in my family die in identical accidents? My grandfather's death certificate said he fell from a ladder while cleaning gutters at age 34. My great-grandfather's obituary from 1957 described the same thing, a ladder accident while cleaning gutters at 34. When I found my great-great-grandfather's death record in the county archives, the cause was identical, fell from ladder, gutter cleaning, age 34. I was 33 years old and 6 months when I discovered this pattern, standing in the records room with photocopies spread across the table, my hands shaking as I counted back 5 generations of firstborn Calloway sons who died the exact same way, at the exact same age. Every single one left behind a widow, younger siblings who inherited everything, and suspiciously large life insurance payouts. My younger brother Trevor had been asking me a lot of questions lately about my insurance policies, about whether I'd updated my beneficiaries, about when I planned to clean the gutters on my house. I'd thought he was just being helpful. But now, staring at these death certificates, I understood he was preparing. I'd started researching after my cousin Dylan died 3 months ago. He was the firstborn son of my Uncle Jerome, and he'd fallen from a ladder while cleaning gutters. He was 34. The funeral was sad, but not shocking. Just a terrible accident, everyone said. Tragic, but these things happen. Except I'd been at Dylan's house 2 weeks before he died, and I'd seen his gutters. They were clean, professionally maintained, nothing that needed attention. Dylan had even joked about it, saying his wife insisted on hiring a service because she didn't want him climbing ladders. So why had he been up there the day he died? Why had he suddenly decided to do it himself when he'd always paid someone else? At the funeral, I'd asked his wife Melissa about it, and she'd looked confused. She said Dylan told her that morning he needed to check something on the roof, that he'd just be a minute. She'd been inside making lunch when she heard the ladder crash. The police ruled it accidental death, case closed within 48 hours. I couldn't let it go. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. So I started digging into family history, looking for patterns. That's when I found the others. 5 generations of firstborn Calloway sons, all dead at 34, all from ladder falls during gutter cleaning. The statistical impossibility was staggering. I ran the numbers with a friend who taught mathematics at the university, and he said the odds of this happening by chance were essentially 0. This was either a genetic predisposition to ladder accidents, which didn't exist, or something else entirely. When I showed him the death certificates and dates, he said, "Someone in your family is killing firstborn sons." He said it so matter-of-factly that I almost didn't process it at first. Then the weight of it hit me. My 34th birthday was in 6 months. I was a firstborn son. And based on the pattern, I was next. I started with the life insurance policies. Each death had resulted in massive payouts I discovered by cross-referencing obituaries with county records and old newspaper articles. My great-great-grandfather's policy paid out $50,000 in 1923, equivalent to over $800,000 today. My great-grandfather's paid $75,000 in 1957. My grandfather's paid $200,000 in 1989. The amounts kept increasing with inflation and economic growth. Dylan's policy, I learned from public probate records, had paid out $2 million. Every single policy had been purchased within 6 months of the victim turning 34, and every single one named the surviving spouse and younger siblings as beneficiaries. In my grandfather's case, the money went to my grandmother and my father's younger brother, Jerome. In Dylan's case, it went to Melissa and my Uncle Jerome. I realized, with sick certainty, that I'd purchased a $3 million life insurance policy 4 months ago at Trevor's suggestion. He'd told me it was smart financial planning now that I was married with a kid. He'd even recommended the insurance agent, a family friend who'd handled all the Calloway policies for decades. I called the insurance agent, a man named Donald Priest, and scheduled a meeting. I didn't tell him what I wanted to discuss, just said I had questions about my policy. His office was in a strip mall near the highway, small and outdated with wood paneling and dusty filing cabinets. Priest was in his 60s, heavy-set, with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. I sat across from his desk and asked him directly how many Calloway firstborn sons he'd insured over the years. His smile faltered, and he said he'd have to check his records. I told him I'd already checked mine, that I knew about my grandfather and great-grandfather and Dylan. I asked him if he thought it was strange that every policyholder died within months of purchasing the insurance. Priest's face went pale, and he said accidents happen, that he couldn't discuss other clients' policies due to confidentiality. I told him I'd be going to the police with my findings, and he could either talk to me now or talk to investigators later. He chose to talk. Priest said he'd suspected something was wrong for years, but he'd never had proof. He said Jerome Calloway had been the one pushing for these policies, always coming in with the firstborn sons, helping them fill out paperwork, recommending coverage amounts. Priest said Jerome had a way of convincing people they needed more insurance than they could afford, that he'd frame it as protecting their families. Priest admitted he'd made substantial commissions on these policies and hadn't asked questions he should have asked. He said the pattern was obvious in retrospect, but at the time, each case seemed isolated. A tragic accident, then years later another one. Different people, different circumstances. He said he'd convinced himself it was just bad luck in an unlucky family. But when Dylan died 3 months ago, Priest said he'd started having nightmares. He'd gone back through his files and found the pattern I'd found. He'd been planning to contact authorities, but hadn't worked up the courage. I asked him who benefited most from these deaths, and he pulled out a ledger showing policy disbursements. In every case, Jerome received a portion of the payout as the deceased's uncle or family trustee. I left Priest's office and drove straight to the police station. I asked to speak with a detective and was directed to a woman named Lieutenant Kara Stevens in the homicide division. I'd brought copies of everything: death certificates, insurance policies, newspaper clippings, family trees, financial records showing Jerome's inheritance patterns. I spread it all across her desk and walked her through 5 generations of identical deaths. Stevens listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she asked me when my 34th birthday was. I told her 6 months. She asked if I'd purchased life insurance recently. I told her about the $3 million policy and Trevor's involvement. She picked up her phone and made several calls, speaking in law enforcement shorthand I couldn't follow. When she hung up, she said she was opening an investigation into Jerome Calloway for suspected serial murder and insurance fraud. She said I needed to be very careful and should consider protective custody. I told her I wanted to help build the case, that I needed to understand what had happened to my grandfather and cousin. She said that depended on what we found. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, Stevens had assembled a task force that included insurance fraud investigators, forensic accountants, and cold case detectives. They exhumed my grandfather's body and found evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of his skull inconsistent with a fall from a ladder. The original autopsy had missed it or ignored it. They reviewed Dylan's autopsy and found similar injuries that the medical examiner had attributed to impact with the ground. But a forensic pathologist brought in by the task force said the wound patterns suggested Dylan had been struck before falling, that someone had hit him hard enough to cause unconsciousness, then staged the ladder fall. The gutters on Dylan's house were examined, and investigators found no debris or leaves, confirming they'd been professionally cleaned recently. There was no reason for Dylan to have been on that ladder, except that someone told him he needed to be there. Stevens obtained phone records showing Jerome had called Dylan the morning of his death, a 12-minute conversation. Melissa confirmed Jerome had stopped by the house that morning, said he wanted to check on Dylan, stayed maybe 20 minutes, then left before the accident. Stevens brought me in for a detailed interview, recording everything. She asked about my relationship with Jerome, with Trevor, with other family members. I told her Jerome had always been around when I was growing up, always offering financial advice, always talking about family legacy and responsibility. He'd been the one to explain my grandfather's death to me when I was a kid, telling me accidents happen and we had to be careful. He'd been the executor of my grandfather's estate, managing the inheritance until my father came of age. He'd done the same for Dylan when Dylan's father died young from cancer. I realized Jerome had positioned himself as the family's financial advisor for decades, controlling trusts and insurance policies and inheritance distributions. Stevens showed me bank records they'd subpoenaed, revealing that Jerome had received over $8 million from various Calloway estates and insurance policies spanning 40 years. He'd built a real estate empire on money that should have gone to widows and children. Trevor was brought in for questioning 2 days later. I watched through a one-way mirror as Stevens interrogated him about the insurance policy he'd encouraged me to buy. Trevor insisted he'd just been helping me plan for my family's future, that he didn't know anything about any pattern of deaths. Stevens asked him about conversations with Jerome regarding my policy, and Trevor's expression changed. He said Jerome had mentioned I should increase my coverage, that $3 million was appropriate for someone in my income bracket. Stevens asked if Jerome had ever discussed what would happen to that money if I died. Trevor went silent for a long time before asking for a lawyer. After the attorney arrived, Trevor made a deal. He'd testify against Jerome in exchange for immunity. He admitted Jerome had approached him 6 months ago with a proposition. If Trevor helped ensure I had adequate life insurance and could arrange for me to have an accident around my 34th birthday, Jerome would give Trevor $1 million and help him eliminate the competition for family inheritance. Trevor said he'd been planning it, figuring out logistics, but hadn't committed to actually doing it. He said he'd been having second thoughts, that he couldn't actually kill his brother. The prosecutors didn't believe him, but they needed his testimony more than they needed his conviction. Jerome was arrested at his office, a sleek downtown suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive art. Stevens said he'd been calm during the arrest, almost expecting it. He refused to answer questions without his attorney present, but his financial records told the story clearly. Bank accounts in his name held over $12 million, all traced back to Calloway family deaths and insurance fraud. His computer files included spreadsheets tracking family members, their ages, their insurance coverage, their beneficiaries. There was a folder labeled Accidents, containing research on ladder safety failures, fall statistics, and medical examiner reports from previous cases. There were notes about my daily routine, where I lived when I typically did yard work. Jerome had been planning my murder with the same methodical precision he'd used for 5 generations of Calloway firstborns. The prosecutor called it one of the most elaborate serial murder schemes she'd ever encountered, a multi-generational conspiracy that had killed at least 5 men and likely more if they dug deeper into family history. The trial started 8 months later. I was 34 by then, past the danger age, and Jerome was in custody facing 5 counts of murder and multiple fraud charges. The prosecution built a timeline showing Jerome's presence at each death scene or his communication with victims shortly before they died. They proved he'd been the one to purchase the ladders used in at least 3 cases, always using cash, always from stores without security cameras. They found a storage unit Jerome had rented under a false name, containing a ladder identical to the one that killed Dylan, with blood evidence still on it. DNA matched Dylan's. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, but what sealed the case was Trevor's testimony. He described in detail how Jerome had explained the family business, how firstborn sons were liabilities who inherited too much and controlled too much wealth. Jerome had learned it from his own father, who'd killed Jerome's older brother back in the 1960s. Trevor said Jerome had framed it as a family tradition, a necessary culling that ensured the strongest survived and resources weren't diluted. Jerome had planned to teach Trevor to continue the tradition, to eventually target his own children if needed. I testified about finding the pattern, about my grandfather's death and Dylan's death, about the insurance policy Trevor had pushed me to buy. I described realizing my brother and uncle were planning to murder me for money, the terror of knowing I was being stalked by my own family. The defense attorney tried to paint me as paranoid, suggested I'd misinterpreted coincidences and family financial planning. But the physical evidence destroyed that narrative. The ladder in Jerome's storage unit, the planning documents on his computer, the financial records showing systematic theft from widows and orphans. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Jerome showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Trevor, despite his immunity deal, lost everything else in civil suits filed by Dylan's widow and other family members. He disappeared after the trial, and I haven't spoken to him since. The insurance companies fought the claims at first, arguing that the policies were fraudulently obtained. But Stevens and the prosecutors proved that the insurance company had been willfully negligent in not investigating the pattern of deaths. Donald Priest testified about flagging his concerns to corporate offices multiple times and being told to process the claims. The insurance companies settled with all the families for undisclosed amounts, but rumors suggested tens of millions in total payouts. Melissa, Dylan's widow, used her settlement to establish a foundation researching financial elder abuse and insurance fraud. My wife and I moved to a different state, wanting distance from the family name and the media attention. I canceled my life insurance policy, wanting nothing that connected me to Jerome's scheme. We changed our son's name legally so he wouldn't carry the Calloway surname. I wanted him free from that legacy entirely. 5 years later, I received a letter from Jerome in prison. It arrived at my new address, meaning he'd tracked me down somehow despite all my efforts at privacy. The letter was typed, neat, formal. Jerome wrote that he wanted me to understand the family history, that his actions weren't motivated by greed but by duty. He claimed the Calloway line had a genetic defect, a mental illness that appeared in firstborn sons, causing them to become violent and destructive. He said his grandfather had discovered this pattern in the 1920s after his own father killed 3 people during a psychotic break. Jerome wrote that the staged accidents were mercy killings, preventing dangerous men from hurting others. He said my grandfather had shown signs of instability before his death, that Dylan had been exhibiting paranoid behavior. Jerome claimed he'd saved lives by ending theirs. I read the letter once, then burned it. Nothing he said was true, I knew that. It was a sociopath's attempt to justify serial murder and theft, to rewrite history in a way that made him a hero instead of a monster. But part of me wondered if he believed it, if he'd told himself these lies for so long that they'd become his reality. I never responded to Jerome's letter, and he never wrote again. He died in prison 6 years into his sentence, stabbed by another inmate during a dispute over commissary items. The news reached me through a terse email from Stevens, who'd stayed in touch periodically. She said she thought I'd want to know it was over, that Jerome couldn't hurt anyone else. I felt relief and anger in equal measure, relieved he was gone but angry that he'd escaped justice by dying relatively young, that he hadn't served decades of the sentence he'd deserved. Trevor surfaced briefly after Jerome's death, posting on social media about forgiveness and moving forward. He'd changed his name too, and was living somewhere in Canada. I blocked him immediately, wanting no connection to anyone who'd participated in the plan to kill me. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and knowing my brother had been willing to murder me for inheritance money falls into that category absolutely. The therapy I'd started after the trial helped me process the trauma, but I still struggle with trust issues, still check locks multiple times, and research anyone who gets too close to my family. The therapist says it's normal after what I experienced, that hypervigilance is a rational response to real danger, but I hate living with constant suspicion. My son is 10 now, and I've told him age-appropriate versions of what happened, wanting him to understand family history without traumatizing him. He knows his great-uncle was a bad man who hurt people, that we left that family behind to start fresh. When he's older, I'll tell him everything, show him the news articles and trial transcripts I've saved. He deserves to know the full truth about where he comes from and what was done in the Calloway name. He asks sometimes why we don't have extended family, why there are no cousins or aunts or uncles at holidays. I tell him some families are small and that's okay. That quality matters more than quantity. He seems to accept this, but I know eventually he'll want more detailed answers. I've prepared a document for him, a complete history of the investigation and trial, something he can read when he's old enough to process it without nightmares. I want him armed with knowledge, able to recognize predatory behavior if he ever encounters it, able to protect himself in ways I wasn't able to protect Dylan or my grandfather. Lieutenant Stevens retired from the police force and wrote a book about the case called The Ladder Murders, A Family's Deadly Secret. She interviewed me extensively for it, and I'm a central figure in the narrative, though she used a pseudonym to protect my privacy. The book became a bestseller, sparking conversations about insurance fraud and family violence and the ways serial killers hide in plain sight. Stevens donated her royalties to victims' advocacy groups, saying she hadn't written the book for profit, but to educate law enforcement and the public about long-term criminal conspiracies. I read it once when it came out, and it was strange seeing my life rendered as a true crime narrative, my memories and trauma transformed into chapters and plot points. But Stevens had been respectful, focusing on the investigation rather than exploiting tragedy for entertainment. She sent me an inscribed copy with a note, thanking me for my courage in coming forward, saying I'd saved not just my own life, but potentially others who might have been targeted if the pattern had continued. I keep the book on a shelf, but haven't opened it since that first reading. Some stories you live through don't need to be revisited. The insurance industry changed policies after the case, implementing better oversight for patterns of deaths among insured families. Donald Priest lost his license and faced criminal charges for willful negligence, though he eventually plea bargained to a suspended sentence in exchange for testimony about industry practices that enabled fraud. The reforms that came from the case mean insurance companies now flag multiple claims from the same family, especially when they involve similar circumstances or ages. It now won't prevent all fraud, but it makes schemes like Jerome's harder to execute across decades. I testified before a congressional subcommittee examining insurance regulation, describing how my family's deaths had been missed by systems that should have caught the pattern immediately. The hearing led to new federal requirements for cross-referencing claims and investigating suspicious patterns. Knowing that some good came from the nightmare provides small comfort, a sense that Dylan's death and my grandfather's death weren't completely meaningless, that they exposed a broken system and forced changes that might protect others. I still have nightmares sometimes about ladders, about falling, about Trevor pushing me from behind. I wake up sweating, checking windows and doors, making sure my family is safe. The therapist says PTSD is common in survivors of attempted murder, especially when the threat comes from family members. She's helped me develop coping strategies, ways to ground myself when the panic starts, but I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. Jerome took that from me, that basic sense of security you're supposed to have in the world. He taught me that the people closest to you can be the most dangerous, that blood ties mean nothing in the face of greed and pathology. It's a dark lesson I wish I hadn't learned, but I can't unlearn it now. I carry it with me, a permanent alteration to how I see people and relationships and family. Some days I resent that burden more than anything else Jerome took. He didn't just try to kill me physically, he killed something inside me, some fundamental trust in human nature that can never be restored. But I survived, and that matters. I'm here raising my son, building a life that has nothing to do with the Calloway name or legacy. I'm 39 now, 5 years past the age when I should have died according to Jerome's plan. Every birthday since 34 has felt like a victory, a middle finger to the pattern that tried to claim me. My wife threw me a surprise party for my 35th birthday, and I broke down crying in front of everyone because I hadn't been sure I'd make it that far. She understood, held me while I sobbed with relief and rage and gratitude. The guests didn't understand, but they were polite enough to pretend everything was normal. Most people can't comprehend what it's like to know your family is actively planning your murder, to have that threat hanging over you for months while you build a case and pray you survive long enough to see justice. It's isolating in a way I struggle to explain even to my therapist. There's no support group for survivors of multi-generational serial killers, no handbook for processing that kind of trauma. I think about the other firstborn sons sometimes, the ones who died before I discovered the pattern. My great-great-grandfather who died in 1923, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 2 young children. My great-grandfather in 1957, killed just as he was, establishing his career as a doctor. My grandfather in 1989, who I never got to meet because he died when my father was only 12. Each of them had futures stolen, families destroyed, dreams ended by a man's greed and pathology. Their widows never knew the truth, never had the chance to see justice done or get closure. They lived with the fiction of tragic accidents, blaming fate or bad luck or God. I carry their stories with me, feel responsible for finally exposing what was done to them. Sometimes I visit their graves, though they're buried in the family plot back home that I otherwise avoid. I tell them I'm sorry it took so long, that I wish I'd discovered the truth before Dylan died. I tell them Jerome paid for what he did, that the pattern is broken and no more firstborn sons will die from staged ladder accidents in the Calloway family. The hardest part is reconciling the memories of Jerome from before I knew the truth with the reality of who he was. I remember him taking me fishing when I was 8, teaching me to cast a line and identify fish. I remember him giving solid advice when I started college, helping me budget and plan for my future. He came to my wedding, gave a toast about family and legacy and continuing traditions. All of it was performance, a carefully maintained facade hiding a serial killer who was already planning my death, calculating how much insurance money he could extract from my corpse. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming sometimes. How could the man who taught me to ride a bike be the same man who murdered my grandfather? How could someone compartmentalize that completely, maintaining normal familial relationships while systematically killing family members? My therapist says sociopaths are skilled at exactly this kind of deception, that Jerome likely didn't experience guilt or conflict about his actions. He saw people as objects, as financial opportunities, as obstacles to be removed. The warmth he showed me was tactical, a way of maintaining cover and access. Understanding that intellectually doesn't make it easier emotionally to accept that everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. Trevor's betrayal cuts differently but just as deep. We were brothers, grew up sharing rooms and secrets, fighting and making up, protecting each other from bullies. I taught him to drive. He was best man at my wedding. We talked about our kids growing up together, about family vacations and holiday traditions. Then he agreed to help murder me for money, discussed logistics with Jerome about how to stage my accident convincingly. Even now, knowing he claimed to have second thoughts, I can't forgive that initial willingness to kill his brother. The immunity deal let him escape prison, but he lost everything else. His wife divorced him once the truth came out. His friends abandoned him. His career in finance ended when no one would hire someone who'd conspired in attempted murder. He lives under a different name, in a different country, cut off from everyone he knew. Part of me is glad he suffers those consequences, that he has to live with what he tried to do. Part of me grieves for the brother I thought I had, the relationship I thought we shared, the family I believed existed. That family was never real, just another fiction Jerome created to hide his crimes. The Calloway estate was dissolved after the trial, the remaining family members agreeing to liquidate assets and distribute them among Dylan's children and other heirs Jerome had stolen from over the decades. The lawyers sorted through 40 years of financial records, tracking where money had gone and who'd been cheated. The process took 3 years and resulted in settlements totaling over $20 million returned to victims' families. My share was substantial, but I gave most of it away to charity and victim support organizations. Keeping money that came from such horror felt wrong, like profiting from my grandfather's murder. My wife understood, and we kept only enough to secure our son's education and our retirement. The rest went to causes that might prevent other families from experiencing what we'd endured. I established a scholarship fund for children of crime victims, wanting to create something positive from the wreckage Jerome left behind. It won't bring back the dead or undo the trauma, but it's something tangible, a way of honoring the firstborn sons who should have lived to old age but never got the chance. I wonder sometimes if there were other victims beyond the 5 documented deaths. Jerome's father had been involved in the scheme, learning it from his father, a pattern going back potentially a century or more. How many other Calloway men died in suspicious accidents before anyone kept detailed records? How many widows struggled alone while Jerome's ancestors enriched themselves on blood money? The investigators tried to trace the conspiracy back further, but records from the early 1900s were incomplete or destroyed. We know the pattern existed for at least 5 generations with certainty, but it might have been longer. That uncertainty haunts me, the possibility that dozens of men died over a century in service of one family's greed and pathology. There's no way to prove it now, no way to bring justice for crimes that happened before modern forensics or record-keeping. Those victims remain ghosts, forgotten except by descendants who might not even know the truth about how their great-great-grandfather really died. I've considered trying to contact distant Calloway relatives, informing them about the pattern in case they want to investigate their own family histories. But reopening old wounds for people who've moved on feels cruel, so I've stayed silent and let the past remain buried except where justice could actually be served. My son asks me sometimes what I'm most proud of in my life, a question his teacher assigned for a school project. I told him I'm proud that I was brave, enough to investigate when something felt wrong, that I trusted my instincts even when it was terrifying, that I stopped a murderer from killing again. He wrote that in his essay, and the teacher called, concerned that he was making up dramatic stories. I had to explain that no, it was true. Here are the news articles and court records if you want verification. The teacher apologized, said she hadn't realized we were that family from the news. She was kind about it, but I saw how she looked at me differently afterward, with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. It's a reaction I've gotten used to over the years. People hear the story and don't know how to respond. They say things like, "That's terrible," or "I can't imagine," which are true, but inadequate. What happened to my family wasn't a natural disaster or random tragedy. It was a century of calculated murder carried out by trusted family members against their own blood. There's no social script for processing that kind of evil, so people default to platitudes and then change the subject as quickly as possible. I've been contacted by several true crime podcasts and documentary producers over the years, all wanting to tell the story of the latter murders. I've declined every request, not wanting my life turned into entertainment or my trauma reduced to content for people's commutes. Stephen's book was different because she was a participant in the investigation and treated the subject matter with appropriate gravity. But the podcast producers just want sensationalism, dramatic readings of autopsy reports, and speculation about Jerome's psychology. They don't care about Dylan or my grandfather or the other victims as human beings. They want a compelling narrative with twists and reveals, and I refuse to participate in that commodification of my family's pain. The story will be told regardless of my cooperation. I know that. It's public record now, available to anyone who wants to dig through court transcripts and news archives. But they won't get my voice, won't get interviews with me describing how it felt to realize my brother wanted me dead. Some things should remain private, held close rather than shared with strangers who have no stake in the outcome beyond entertainment value. The settlement money I kept went into a trust for my son's education, ensuring he'll have opportunities my grandfather never got to provide his children. He's interested in medicine, talks about becoming a doctor like his great-grandfather planned to before Jerome killed him. I encourage that dream, while being realistic about the commitment required. He's smart enough and determined enough to succeed if he chooses that path. Watching him grow up, seeing him develop interests and ambitions, makes me think about all the potential that was stolen when Jerome killed those 5 men. Who might they have become if they'd lived? What might they have contributed to the world? My grandfather was studying architecture before he died. Dylan was starting a nonprofit for at-risk youth. Each death was not just a life ended, but all the ripples that life would have created erased before they could spread. The true cost of Jerome's crimes is incalculable, measured not just in deaths, but in all the children who grew up fatherless, all the marriages that ended, all the futures that never happened. I'm writing this now because my son asked me to document everything, to create a record he can read when he's older. He's at the age where he's starting to understand the magnitude of what happened, starting to ask detailed questions about the investigation and trial. His therapist suggested I write it down comprehensively, so he has answers to reference without having to repeatedly ask me to relive painful memories. So this is for him, a thorough account of how I discovered the pattern, built the case, survived the attempts on my life, and saw justice done. It's also for any other Calloway descendants who might someday wonder about their family history, who might have heard whispers about suspicious deaths and want to know the truth. This is that truth, unfiltered and complete. The Calloway family was poisoned by greed for over a century, and that poison manifested as staged accidents that murdered at least 5 innocent men and traumatized countless family members. Jerome Calloway was the last active murderer in that legacy, and he died in prison for his crimes. The pattern is broken now, the conspiracy exposed, the victims acknowledged. No more firstborn sons will die from ladder accidents in this family. That cycle ended with my survival and Jerome's conviction. It's not the legacy I wanted to leave my son, but it's the truth, and truth matters more than comfortable lies. He'll carry this knowledge into his future, and I pray it makes him wiser and more vigilant without making him paranoid or bitter. I survived, so he could have a different story, a better story. That's justice enough for me. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.